Berlin, 1944. Thousands of feet above the city, silver bombers crawl through flak and fire. For months these men flew knowing they might never come home. Out of fuel, out of range, and out of luck. Then came a strange new weapon. Not a gun, not a bomb, but a simple metal cylinder hanging beneath a wing. It looked like nothing, yet it would change everything. When American pilots strapped those tanks on, suddenly Berlin was no longer untouchable. January 5th, 1944. The sky above Berlin is a cold gray canvas, streaked with the trails of high-altitude contrails. Below, the city sleeps uneasily, unaware that the war is creeping closer to its heart. In the cockpit of a P-51 Mustang, a pilot adjusts his oxygen mask, the metallic taste of altitude mingling with the acrid scent of aviation fuel. His eyes scan the horizon, restless, alert. Every distant puff of flak over the city feels like a pulse, measuring danger, counting heartbeats. Beneath his wings, an innovation clings silently. The drop tank. Cylindrical, unassuming, it carries the lifeblood that will stretch his Mustang beyond previous limits across hundreds of miles of enemy territory. For months, pilots have dreamed of this moment. Long-range missions escorting bombers deep into Germany, confronting the Luftwaffe over Berlin itself. Engines roar, breaking the fragile dawn. Somewhere below, the city's chimneys send up thin trails of smoke, and in the distance the first radar-guided searchlights pierce the morning haze. Soon every twist of throttle, every maneuver will be a test, not just of skill, but of survival. The war is about to arrive in Berlin's skies. By late 1943, the air war over Europe had reached a new intensity. The United States Army Air Forces had committed to a strategy of daylight precision bombing, targeting Germany's industrial heart, rail networks, and oil refineries. Unlike the British, who conducted nighttime raids, U.S. bombers flew in broad daylight to maximize accuracy, but the cost was high. Without long-range fighter escorts, formations of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators were vulnerable to every Luftwaffe fighter that could reach them. Berlin, the nerve center of the Third Reich, had become the ultimate objective. Its sprawling industrial complexes, communications hubs, and symbolic power made it a target impossible to ignore. Yet the distance from Allied bases in England and Italy posed a relentless problem. Even the fastest P-38 Lightnings and P-51 Mustangs struggled to accompany the bombers all the way, forcing U.S. planners to accept devastating bomber losses over the heavily defended city. The Luftwaffe, by this time, was an experienced and deadly opponent. Squadrons of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s patrolled the skies, coordinating attacks with radar guidance and flak batteries hidden around key industrial sites. Pilots learned quickly that a small miscalculation in altitude, speed, or formation could be fatal. Every daylight raid was a calculated risk, a careful dance between precision and survival. Commanders on both sides understood the stakes. U.S. leaders, from General Henry Hap Arnold down to squadron commanders in England, grappled with the same question. How could they extend the reach of their fighter escorts without overhauling entire airfields or aircraft designs? The answer began to take shape not in the skies over Berlin, but in the workshops and hangars of American industry. Here, engineers and mechanics experimented with auxiliary fuel tanks, drop tanks, attached beneath wings, carrying additional fuel for long-range missions. Simple in concept, these tanks were anything but trivial. They added weight, altered handling characteristics, and if damaged, could explode violently. Still, the potential payoff was clear. With drop tanks, fighters could escort bombers deeper into enemy territory, providing protection where none had existed before. Pilots trained for months to adapt. Long-range flights demanded endurance, both physical and mental. Cockpit temperatures hovered near freezing at 25,000 feet. Oxygen was rationed carefully. Fuel management became a constant concern. One wrong calculation could strand a fighter far from home. Yet the promise of seeing Berlin from above, of finally shielding the bombers all the way to the Reich's capital, drove these airmen to endure conditions that would have broken lesser men. At the same time, intelligence reports painted a sobering picture. German radar networks, anti-aircraft batteries, and fighter patrols were concentrated around industrial zones. The Reich's early warning system could detect formations approaching hundreds of miles out, giving the Luftwaffe precious minutes to intercept. Any extended-range escort would require pilots to balance aggression with caution, flying low enough to evade radar while maintaining formation discipline, all while aware that a single engine failure or misstep could end their mission or their lives. The strategic dilemma was stark. Without long-range escorts, bomber formations would continue to take heavy losses. With them, the U.S. could begin pressing its advantage, slowly eroding the Luftwaffe's dominance in the skies. Drop tanks represented the bridge between these two realities. They were not glamorous, not headline-making, but in the hands of determined pilots they would become instruments of a new type of air warfare. By the winter of 1943, test flights had begun. Mustangs carrying full drop tanks demonstrated the range needed to reach Berlin and return safely. Squadrons were briefed, tactics were revised, and a quiet confidence began to build. Soon, the first operational missions would prove whether these auxiliary tanks could survive the rigors of combat, and whether the pilots who depended on them could survive the skies over the Reich. The stakes were clear. Failure meant the loss of hundreds of bombers and countless young men. Success promised something previously unimaginable: the ability to bring the fight directly to Berlin, altering the air war in ways that commanders had long dreamed of, but never dared to attempt. The pilots of the U.S. Army Air Forces, still unaware of what Berlin itself would demand of them, prepared for the missions that would test every innovation, every ounce of courage, and every drop of fuel. While the concept of drop tanks was straightforward, additional fuel stored in a jettisonable container beneath a fighter's wings, the practical challenges were formidable. Engineers had to ensure that the tanks would not compromise stability or performance, and that they could be safely released mid-flight. Early tests revealed problems: fuel leaks, structural stress on the wings, and changes to handling that could catch even experienced pilots off guard. Each prototype flight became a careful balance of risk and innovation. By late 1943, however, these obstacles were being overcome. The P-51 Mustang, already prized for its speed and maneuverability, proved particularly well suited to carry external tanks. Modifications allowed the aircraft to hold two 75-gallon drop tanks under its wings, doubling its operational range. For the first time, pilots could consider missions deep into German territory without the constant fear of running out of fuel on the way home. Commanders calculated that with these tanks, long-range escort missions could accompany B-17s and B-24s all the way to Berlin, providing the protection that had been impossible before. Training became an intensive, exacting process. Pilots practiced long-distance navigation, fuel management, and emergency procedures for releasing tanks over hostile territory. They simulated formation flying for hours, learning to manage the subtle changes in lift and drag that could throw a formation into chaos. Fatigue was a constant threat. Missions that could last 10 hours or more meant sitting for extended periods in freezing cockpits, eyes fixed on instruments, fingers poised over controls, every sense alert to the slightest sign of danger. Meanwhile, intelligence officers studied the German defenses that awaited them. Berlin was ringed with flak batteries, anti-aircraft guns designed to shred bombers and any escort fighters that strayed too close. Radar stations provided early warning, allowing the Luftwaffe to coordinate intercepts with precision. Mi-109s and Fe-190s, often guided by radio-controlled vectors, could strike formations before they reached critical targets. The city itself was a fortress in the sky, a combination of technology and human calculation, and every flight over it was a negotiation with mortality. The U.S. military understood that drop tanks would not guarantee survival. They were a tool, not a shield. But they offered something that had previously been unattainable: choice. Pilots could now decide when to engage the enemy, how to position themselves for defense, and when to disengage and return safely. Commanders could extend their strategic reach, pressing the Luftwaffe into a defensive posture and slowly eroding the dominance they had held for years. As preparations intensified, early operational missions were planned with meticulous attention to detail. Squadrons were briefed on weather patterns, anticipated German fighter patrols, and potential flak concentrations. Drop tanks became central to mission planning. Their very presence changed tactics. Fighters could climb to escort altitude more quickly, shadow bombers across hostile territory, and remain with formations until the last explosive reached its target. These missions would test not only the technology, but the endurance, judgment, and nerves of every pilot involved. By January 1944, the first significant missions were scheduled. The airmen were ready, but the skies over Berlin were unforgiving. Every flak burst, every shadow of a German fighter, every sudden shift in wind or temperature would challenge the limits of both man and machine. Yet behind the cockpit doors, a quiet determination persisted. These pilots understood that success would require precision, courage, and complete trust in the tools they carried, particularly the drop tanks that would extend their reach into the heart of the Reich. The stage was set. The U.S. Army Air Forces were poised to take a step that would redefine the air war over Europe. With drop tanks, they could finally project power deep into Germany, challenging the Luftwaffe on its own territory and escorting the bombers that had suffered devastating losses for years. The first flights over Berlin would reveal whether this calculated gamble could succeed, and whether American ingenuity and bravery could overcome one of the most formidable air defenses in history. The pilots of the U.S. Army Air Forces were more than skilled aviators. They were endurance athletes, navigating long stretches of hostile airspace with nothing but their training, instruments, and instincts. Flights over Germany could last 10 hours or more, with cockpit temperatures dropping well below freezing at high altitudes. Every muscle ached, every finger stiffened from hours of operating controls, and yet there was no room for error. The introduction of drop tanks extended these missions, stretching the limits of human endurance even further. Inside the cockpit, every pilot faced the same quiet tension. Oxygen masks pressed against faces, eyes darting between gauges, engines, and the distant clouds that might conceal enemy fighters. There was no background music, no relief, only the constant hum of engines, the faint vibration through the fuselage, and the knowledge that one miscalculation could be fatal. Pilots relied on mental discipline to counter fatigue, focusing on fuel levels, formation integrity, and the movement of bombers they were sworn to protect. For many, the psychological pressure was as demanding as the physical. Crossing into the heart of Germany meant confronting flak bursts, enemy fighters, and the ever-present risk of mechanical failure. Yet the presence of drop tanks offered a fragile reassurance. With extended range, pilots could maneuver strategically, retreat when necessary, and plan attacks with a measure of confidence previously impossible. These tanks became silent partners in every mission, a lifeline extending beyond the horizon and, in a way, an anchor for courage in the cold. Thin air above Berlin. Before drop tanks, long-range escort missions were almost an impossibility. Fighter planes could reach the outskirts of German territory, but Berlin itself remained a distant, unguarded prize for bombers. Tactically, this forced U.S. commanders into a grim calculus: risk bomber losses for incomplete coverage or limit targets to closer, less strategic sites. The introduction of drop tanks shifted this balance. Now tactical formations could be maintained over extended distances. P-51 Mustangs and P-38 Lightnings, fueled beyond their standard capacity, could climb to meet bombers as they approached German defenses. The very presence of fighters in the formation forced the Luftwaffe into defensive maneuvers. German interceptors, accustomed to unescorted bomber raids, now faced disciplined, well-armed escort fighters with long legs and sharp reflexes. Drop tanks allowed for aggressive positioning. Pilots could patrol above and alongside the bombers, intercepting threats before they reached the fragile bomber fuselages. Additionally, drop tanks allowed commanders to experiment with mission timing and routing. Bombers could depart earlier, maintain tighter formations, or navigate through corridors previously considered too risky. Escort fighters could rotate positions, monitor flanks, and respond dynamically to enemy maneuvers. In short, drop tanks expanded the tactical envelope, turning the escort from a reactive defense into a proactive shield and, eventually, a tool for offensive pressure on the Luftwaffe. At first glance, a drop tank was unremarkable, a cylindrical container of aluminum bolted beneath a fighter's wings. But the engineering behind it was complex. Designers had to account for weight distribution, aerodynamic drag, and structural integrity. A misaligned tank could throw off the aircraft's handling, making precision formation flying nearly impossible. Fuel safety was another critical concern. Any leak could ignite under combat conditions, turning a fighter into a bomb. Engineers developed reinforced seals, jettison mechanisms, and venting systems to mitigate these risks. They also worked closely with pilots to ensure that the tanks could be released quickly if damaged. The result was a reliable, battle-ready system that significantly extended the operational range of U.S. fighters without sacrificing performance. Drop tanks were, in essence, a bridge between human ambition and technological possibility. They were not flashy, but they were revolutionary. They transformed ordinary fighters into long-range escort platforms, capable of sustaining missions deep over enemy territory. In doing so, they redefined what air power could achieve in the European theater. The adoption of drop tanks was not just a technical innovation. It was the result of decisive leadership. Generals and commanders of the U.S. Army Air Forces understood that the Luftwaffe's dominance over German skies was limiting the effectiveness of the Allied bombing campaign. Leaders like General Henry Hap Arnold recognized that only by extending the range of fighter escorts could the air war over Germany be won. Arnold and his staff faced skepticism. Critics warned that long-range missions were too risky, that pilots might run out of fuel, and that drop tanks themselves could fail catastrophically. Yet the leadership pressed forward, balancing the risks against the potential strategic payoff. They coordinated closely with engineers, pilots, and intelligence officers to refine tactics, determine the optimal loadouts, and plan precise mission routes. This leadership extended down to squadron commanders, who translated strategic vision into actionable orders. They trained pilots rigorously, ensuring that each fighter could operate safely with a drop tank, execute complex formation maneuvers, and respond to enemy threats with precision. By aligning vision, technology, and human skill, U.S. leadership ensured that drop tanks would not remain theoretical. They would become a central tool in the fight over Berlin. The German perspective on these missions reveals the magnitude of the challenge. Luftwaffe commanders, accustomed to dominating the skies over Germany, now faced fighters that could accompany bombers far deeper than ever before. Radar operators tracked formations that seemed to stretch endlessly, while Mi-109s and FW-190s were forced to engage in prolonged dogfights, exhausting fuel and pilot stamina. Drop tanks changed the Luftwaffe's calculus. Previously, intercepts could be timed to strike vulnerable bombers with minimal risk, but extended escort meant that German fighters were constantly confronted with superior numbers and range. Every engagement became more dangerous, and losses, particularly among experienced pilots, mounted. Tactically, the Germans began altering patrol patterns, concentrating flak batteries near anticipated bomber routes, and attempting to disrupt formations before they could consolidate. Still, the technological advantage of drop tanks gradually undermined their defensive strategies, forcing them into reactive rather than proactive roles. The impact of drop tanks extended beyond technology and tactics. It had a profound strategic and moral effect on both sides. For American crews, the presence of extended-range escort fighters offered reassurance in missions that were otherwise perilous gambles. Pilots reported that morale improved significantly when P-51s remained overhead throughout bombing runs, intercepting enemy fighters and absorbing the first waves of flak. This psychological edge, combined with the tactical advantage, allowed the Allies to press deeper into German airspace with renewed confidence. For the Germans, the effect was the opposite. Cities like Berlin, previously able to rely on layered defenses to deter raids, now faced a constant threat. Civilians and military personnel alike witnessed bombers reaching industrial districts under the persistent shadow of American fighters. The knowledge that Allied forces could penetrate so deeply into the Reich had both a tactical and psychological impact, forcing the Germans to reconsider strategies and reallocate scarce resources to counter a threat that seemed to appear from nowhere. Strategically, drop tanks enabled the Allies to take control of the air over Germany in a way previously unimaginable. They allowed fighter squadrons to escort bombers throughout entire missions, reducing losses, increasing bombing effectiveness, and shifting the balance of power in the European air war. What had started as a simple fuel extension device became a force multiplier, transforming long-range air strategy and signaling a turning point in the skies over Europe. By extending range, preserving bomber formations, and disrupting Luftwaffe dominance, drop tanks set the stage for a decisive turning point. The first missions that fully utilized these tanks would demonstrate the potential of this innovation in real combat, transforming theoretical advantages into tangible, strategic outcomes. These flights would test every pilot, every aircraft, and every leader in the high-risk theater of Berlin, culminating in moments that would define the air war over Europe. February 3, 1944. The early morning sky over England was thick with frost and anticipation. Squadrons of B-17 flying fortresses loaded with bombs destined for Berlin lined up on the airfield. Escorting them were P-51 Mustangs, each equipped with full drop tanks. For the pilots, this was more than another mission. It was a test of months of preparation, ingenuity, and nerve. As engines roared to life, the airfield vibrated under the collective thrust. Pilots in the cockpits checked fuel gauges, oxygen supplies, and weapon systems. Every detail mattered. Any oversight could turn a routine formation into a disaster hundreds of miles over hostile territory. As the Mustang squadrons lifted off into the gray dawn, the drop tanks beneath their wings symbolized a promise: reach Berlin and return. The promise carried both hope and an unspoken risk. The flight across the North Sea was tense but uneventful, each pilot scanning the clouds for signs of enemy aircraft. Drop tanks, silent and unassuming beneath the wings, extended the fighters' reach into the heart of Germany. The calculations made in hangars, laboratories, and training fields were now being tested in reality. For the first time, American fighters could accompany bombers for the entire mission, shielding them from the deadly Luftwaffe patrols that had claimed hundreds of bombers in prior raids. Approaching the German coast, the tension mounted. Radar installations had long since detected the formation, and Luftwaffe squadrons scrambled to intercept. In the distance, the sleek silhouettes of Me-109s and FW-190s sliced through the clouds, converging with lethal precision. Pilots adjusted throttle and altitude, maintaining formation while preparing for combat. The first flashes of tracer fire illuminated the sky, and the air filled with the sound of machine guns and the distant thump of flak. Here, the drop tanks proved their worth. Pilots could maintain high-speed climbs to intercept German fighters without fear of depleting fuel reserves. They could maneuver aggressively, engaging the enemy on American terms. Some pilots released their tanks early to gain additional agility, watching as the metal cylinders fell away silently, leaving only a trail of vapor in the sky. Each jettisoned tank marked both a tactical decision and a psychological milestone. a tangible commitment to completing the mission and returning home. Within minutes, the fight escalated. Dogfights erupted around the bomber formations, P-51s diving and banking to shield B-17s from attacks. The Germans pressed hard, but the longer-range American fighters outlasted them, outmaneuvering and outnumbering the opposition in critical engagements. A B-17 formation, once vulnerable, now moved with a protective wall of Mustangs above and beside them. The drop tanks, though now gone for some, had allowed these maneuvers, giving pilots the endurance to maintain the escort for the entire mission. Every cockpit contained a story of skill and survival. One pilot reported sighting a Mi-109 diving from 12 o'clock high, its guns blazing. The Mustang pilot twisted into a defensive role, anticipating the enemy's trajectory, and fired a disciplined burst. Moments later, the German fighter spiraled down out of the fight. Across the formation, similar encounters unfolded simultaneously, a ballet of speed, strategy, and split-second decision-making. Drop tanks had given these pilots the margin to fight, retreat, and re-engage, turning an impossible mission into a manageable, though deadly, operation. The flight into Berlin itself was a tense, surreal experience. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from the city below, black puffs marking the location of concealed batteries. Pilots reported the explosions as shock waves through the wings, rattling instruments and shaking nerves. Yet the presence of full-strength escorts kept the bombers on course, shielding them from concentrated Luftwaffe attacks. For the first time, American air power penetrated the German capital with minimal attrition, achieving a level of precision and protection never before possible. By the time the bombers released their payloads, the escorting Mustangs had already proven the value of extended range. German fighters, frustrated and depleted, began retreating as flak lit the sky in fragmented bursts. Pilots breathed a collective sigh of relief, not because the danger was over, but because the mission, against all odds, had reached its climax and now shifted toward survival on the return flight. The success of this mission would echo far beyond the skies of Berlin. Drop tanks had transformed strategy into reality, enabling prolonged escort missions that changed the nature of air warfare over Europe. The bravery of the pilots, combined with the ingenuity of engineers and the foresight of commanders, marked a turning point. From this moment onward, the U.S. could press its advantage in the air, testing German defenses in ways previously unthinkable. The story, however, was not yet complete. For every success came near misses, mechanical failures, and the unrelenting threat of combat. The return journey would demand every ounce of endurance, discipline, and skill, further proving that the combination of human courage and technological innovation could indeed bring the war to Berlin's skies. As the formation turned westward, leaving Berlin behind, the mission was far from over. The return leg demanded the same vigilance as the attack itself. Fatigue had begun to set in. Pilots who had spent hours scanning for enemy fighters, managing fuel, and enduring freezing cockpit temperatures now faced the challenge of maintaining formation discipline while crossing hundreds of miles of hostile territory. Every remaining drop tank, every ounce of fuel became critical. Mechanical failures, though rare, tested both aircraft and crew. Some Mustangs reported engine stutters caused by cold extended operation. Others had released tanks prematurely to regain maneuverability, now flying lighter but with less margin for error. Yet the extended range provided by drop tanks allowed these pilots to correct mistakes, regain formation, and continue escorting the bombers without compromising the mission. The Luftwaffe, having been repelled over Berlin, attempted to mount a counterattack. Fresh squadrons of Mi-109s intercepted the formation near Magdeburg and Leipzig. Dogfights erupted once again, with Mustang pilots leveraging their remaining fuel and energy advantage to outmaneuver the enemy. German pilots were forced into high-risk maneuvers, chasing increasingly agile opponents who could endure hours of combat thanks to the auxiliary fuel. Many Luftwaffe pilots would not survive the engagement, while American escorts, though stressed and exhausted, maintained cohesion. Flak remained a persistent threat. Over industrial zones and transportation hubs, black puffs of anti-aircraft fire detonated in the thin morning sky. Bombers occasionally shuddered under shock waves, but escort fighters held fast. The drop tanks, though often empty by this point, had made the difference in timing and positioning, allowing the Mustangs to engage threats without sacrificing bomber protection. For many pilots, the experience was a revelation. The technology that had seemed like a simple tool had become the lifeline of both men and machines. By the time the English coastline appeared below, the formation had survived nearly 8 hours of continuous combat. Pilots reported a mixture of relief and awe. The mission had succeeded beyond expectations. Bombers had reached Berlin, released their payloads, and returned with a fraction of the losses previously considered inevitable. The strategic effect was immediate. Commanders in England analyzed the flight logs and after-action reports and realized that the extended-range escorts had reshaped the operational landscape. This success would not remain isolated. Within weeks, additional squadrons adopted drop tanks, refining tactics based on lessons learned. The Luftwaffe, once confident in its ability to dominate the skies over Berlin, faced a persistent, relentless challenge. German intelligence noted the extended range and effectiveness of American fighters, prompting adjustments in fighter patrol patterns, flak deployment, and even aircraft production priorities. Yet the psychological advantage now rested with the Allies. Pilots who had once feared the journey over Germany now possessed a tool that offered both protection and tactical freedom. The cumulative effect of these missions was profound. Bombing campaigns could now reach targets previously considered too distant. Industrial production in Berlin and beyond came under sustained pressure, and the morale of both American airmen and German civilians shifted. The war in the air was no longer a series of attritional encounters. It was a coordinated, strategic effort enabled by technology, planning, and human endurance. Among the pilots, a quiet pride took hold. They had flown farther than any escort before, engaged the enemy in sustained combat, and returned alive to tell the story. Yet there was no room for celebration. Each mission reinforced the peril of the skies over Europe, the constant need for vigilance, and the reality that innovation alone could not guarantee survival. Only careful execution, courage, and experience. By the end of February 1944, it was clear. The combination of drop tanks and disciplined, well-trained pilots had changed the air war. Berlin's skies were no longer an impenetrable fortress. For the first time, the U.S. Army Air Forces could project power deep into Germany with a level of precision, protection, and endurance that demanded a response. The turning point was not a single moment but a series of calculated risks, technological innovations, and human feats that together redefined the strategic landscape. The next stage, the aftermath of these missions, would reveal the full impact of this innovation, the effect on bomber survival, German defenses, pilot morale, and the shifting momentum of the air war. The story of drop tanks was far from over. It had only begun to reshape the skies over Europe, heralding a new era of American air power. The first missions that fully utilized drop tanks had immediate and measurable effects. Bomber losses over Berlin dropped significantly compared to previous raids. Intelligence reports recorded that formations of B-17s and B-24s, once vulnerable to sustained Luftwaffe attacks, were now arriving at targets with intact squadrons. Pilots credited the extended-range escorts for reducing casualties and maintaining cohesion. Commanders began analyzing sortie data and realized that the innovation had effectively shifted the balance in the air war. Fuel calculations, once a source of constant anxiety, became a manageable variable. Pilots could now extend missions with confidence, engaging the enemy on their own terms. Drop tanks offered a critical window of operational flexibility. Even when tanks were jettisoned early to improve maneuverability, they had served their purpose, allowing pilots to cross heavily defended zones while retaining enough fuel for combat and safe return. For the Luftwaffe, the impact was immediate and unsettling. German intelligence noted the extended range of American fighters, forcing adjustments in both patrol patterns and interception tactics. Flak batteries, previously concentrated on the outskirts of the city, were repositioned to cover longer corridors, but the additional coverage still could not fully compensate for the protective presence of P-51 escorts. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots found themselves engaged far from home territory, often outnumbered and outmaneuvered, a reversal that strained both morale and resources. The human dimension of these changes was equally profound. Pilots who had flown long-range missions reported a newfound confidence. Morale within bomber crews improved, knowing that the once vulnerable formations now carried a protective shield through the most dangerous segments of their routes. Pilots spoke of the quiet reassurance of glancing to their left or right and seeing a Mustang in formation, wings bristling with weapons, engines humming steadily, drop tanks having already carried them far beyond what they could have previously imagined. Strategically, the introduction of drop tanks had enabled a new phase of the bombing campaign. Allied planners could now target Berlin and other distant industrial centers with a higher probability of mission success. The extended reach allowed them to pressure the German war economy more consistently, striking at factories, transportation hubs, and fuel depots previously considered too distant or risky. With the Luftwaffe forced into prolonged defensive operations, the Allies began to seize the initiative in the air, slowly eroding German air superiority over critical regions. Even small operational details mattered. Pilots reported that timing attacks became easier with the additional range. They could coordinate bombing runs with precision, maintain optimal altitude for both escort and bomber aircraft, and adjust tactics in response to enemy movements. Every successful mission reinforced lessons learned. Drop tanks were no longer experimental. They were essential tools for sustained air campaigns. By the end of the first wave of operations, statistics confirmed what pilots already knew instinctively. Losses had decreased, bombing accuracy had improved, and Luftwaffe sorties were increasingly reactive. The operational doctrine had changed. Fighter escorts were no longer constrained by geography, and American air power had gained the ability to project influence deep into the Reich. The psychological impact on both sides was significant. German pilots began to view long-range escort missions with caution, while Allied crews took pride in a capability that had seemed impossible only months earlier. Drop tanks, once a simple logistical solution, had become a symbol of American ingenuity, endurance, and tactical foresight. The stage was now set for the broader consequences of these missions. The operational successes over Berlin would ripple across the European theater, influencing strategy, pilot training, and production priorities. What had begun as a single technological adaptation had become a defining factor in the air war. The impact of drop tanks extended far beyond the immediate reduction in bomber losses. Within weeks, Allied planners recognized that extended-range fighter escorts could alter entire campaigns. Bombing missions over Berlin and other distant industrial centers became more frequent and more effective. The Allies were no longer constrained by geography or the vulnerability of unescorted bombers. They now controlled the skies, dictating when, where, and how air operations could unfold. The Luftwaffe, though still formidable, was forced into a defensive posture. Experienced pilots were stretched thin, tasked with intercepting bombers deep within their own territory. Casualty reports reflected the changing tide. More German fighters were lost in extended-range engagements than in previous short-range encounters. Aircrew morale declined under the constant pressure of longer missions and a sky increasingly dominated by well-escorted American formations. German tactics shifted as well. Radar operators tried to anticipate the longer-range attacks, Flak batteries were repositioned, and fighter patrols extended further from cities. But these measures could not fully negate the advantage drop tanks had conferred. For American pilots, the missions instilled confidence but also underscored the cost of innovation. Extended range flights tested endurance to extremes, 10 hours or more in freezing cockpits, high-altitude navigation, and the constant threat of enemy action. Official mission reports frequently cited fatigue as a critical factor, noting that even well-trained pilots required careful rotation and support. Yet the combination of human resilience and technological adaptation produced results that reshaped strategic thinking. Drop tanks were no longer optional. They were a prerequisite for sustained dominance in the European air theater. Contemporary accounts from bomber crews further illustrate the shift. One B-17 pilot noted in his post-mission report, "With the Mustangs alongside us all the way, we flew with a confidence that was once impossible. The flak still rattled the fuselage, but we could concentrate on the target instead of fearing the sky." Another squadron report highlighted the tactical flexibility afforded by extended-range escorts. Pilots could climb to optimal altitude, evade flak concentrations, and repel Luftwaffe attacks without sacrificing formation integrity. These testimonies underscore the human dimension of the technology. Drop tanks empowered both fighters and bombers to operate at peak effectiveness under extreme conditions. The broader strategic implications were equally significant. With extended-range escorts, the Allies could sustain bombing pressure on Berlin's industrial core, disrupting armaments production and fuel supplies. Factories previously shielded by distance or layered defenses became accessible, forcing Germany into a reactionary stance. Combined with other Allied operations, these missions contributed to the gradual erosion of German war-making capacity, tilting the balance of air superiority increasingly in favor of the United States. Over time, the lessons learned from these missions informed doctrine across the air forces. Training programs incorporated long-range navigation, fuel management, and drop tank operations as standard elements. Tactical manuals emphasized the importance of maintaining escort integrity throughout the mission, adapting maneuvers for the altered flight characteristics of loaded aircraft. In effect, a simple technological adaptation had reshaped the way air campaigns were conceived, executed, and evaluated. By the spring of 1944, the results were undeniable. The combination of drop tanks, disciplined pilots, and coordinated leadership had established a new paradigm. Long-range escort missions were feasible, effective, and transformative. German defenses, though still lethal, could no longer dominate the airspace above critical industrial centers. American air power had acquired a persistent edge, one that would have consequences throughout the remainder of the European campaign. The psychological effects were mirrored on both sides. U.S. crews approached missions with a sense of agency that had been absent in earlier campaigns. German pilots faced an increasingly relentless adversary, their confidence undermined by the knowledge that American fighters could reach them anywhere over their homeland. Reports and memoirs from both sides confirm the magnitude of this shift. Drop tanks were not merely tools, they were instruments that reshaped the operational, tactical, and psychological dimensions of the air war over Europe. The success of these missions foreshadowed future operations in other theaters, highlighting the interplay between innovation, human endurance, and strategic vision. Drop tanks had transformed not only the capacity to reach Berlin, but the very way air power could be projected. They proved that even incremental technological adaptations, when applied decisively, could alter the course of a campaign, setting the stage for the final phases of the air war. The story of drop tanks is in many ways a story of ingenuity meeting necessity. A simple cylinder of fuel, mounted beneath a fighter's wing, transformed the possibilities of air warfare. It allowed men to stretch beyond the limits imposed by geography and physics, to escort bombers deep into enemy territory, and to confront a formidable opponent on terms that were once unimaginable. Yet the significance of drop tanks goes beyond machinery or engineering. They symbolize the intersection of human courage and technological foresight. For the pilots, each mission was a test not only of skill but of endurance, judgment, and resolve. Hours in freezing, cramped cockpits surrounded by the constant threat of flak and enemy fighters demanded focus and discipline. The drop tanks were more than fuel. They were instruments of survival, confidence, and tactical freedom. They allowed pilots to make decisions in real time, to protect their comrades, and to push the boundaries of what had been considered possible in aerial combat. On the strategic level, these missions reshaped the European air war. The ability to maintain continuous fighter coverage over Berlin and other distant targets reduced bomber losses, increased mission success, and undermined German air defenses. What had begun as a logistical adaptation became a force multiplier, tipping the scales in favor of the Allies and demonstrating that small innovations, carefully applied, could have enormous consequences. Ultimately, the story of drop tanks is a reminder that warfare is not defined solely by numbers or weaponry. It is shaped by those who imagine what is possible, who endure hardship, and who act decisively when opportunity arises. In the cold, thin air above Berlin, American pilots combined human endurance with technological innovation to alter the course of the air war. Their achievement was not just in reaching the city, it was in proving that ingenuity and courage, applied together, could bring the war to the skies of the enemy and leave an enduring mark on history. In the end, drop tanks were small, silent, and unassuming, yet they carried more than fuel. They carried the reach of human determination, extending the impact of every mission and redefining the very meaning of air power in the Second World War. They called them drop tanks. Just fuel, just metal, yet they carried the reach of a nation and the courage of every man who dared to fly beyond the horizon. Their story is a reminder that victory isn't always born from strength, but from the will to endure, to innovate, and to remember. If stories like this matter to you, and keep them alive, subscribe, comment, share, because history fades, unless we choose to keep it burning. In the silence above Berlin, the fuel still burns.